Hi everyone, welcome to lecture 15 part 1 on the method of difference. The objectives for this video are the following. After watching, everyone should be able to, number 1, describe the method of difference, and number 2, apply the method of difference using property tables. So far we've seen two of Mill's methods, the direct method of agreement and the inverse method of agreement. We saw that the direct method of agreement was a method for finding suspected necessary conditions of a given conditioned property, and that the inverse method of agreement was a method for finding suspected sufficient conditions of a given conditioned property. So here's where we're up to with things. The method of difference, which we'll look at in this video, is used with a more restricted goal in mind than the methods we've seen so far. It's used to find out which of the properties present in a certain occurrence of the conditioned property might be sufficient conditions for that conditioned property. So we're going to unpack this with an example that will hopefully make clear the difference between this method and the ones we've seen in the previous two videos. Because we're using the method to find out which of the properties present in a certain occurrence of the conditioned property are sufficient conditions for that conditioned property, in general, when we use the method of difference, we will begin by recording an occurrence in which the conditioned property is present. So suppose we're interested in which of the possible conditioning properties A, B, C, and D are sufficient conditions for the conditioned property E that are present in an occurrence of E. Suppose next that we record an occurrence in which E is present. We will always, in this class, label this occurrence occurrence 0, like this. So E is present in occurrence 0. And suppose our observations are such that A is present, B is absent, C is present, and D is present. So again, there are four possible conditioning properties, A, B, C, and D. And in occurrence 0, the conditioned property E is also present. Now, if we're testing for sufficient conditions that are present in an occurrence of E, we can't actually eliminate anything yet. We said that when we test for sufficient conditions, the conditioned property has to be absent, because only then will the golden rule that you can see on the screen, that a property P cannot be a sufficient condition for a property Q if P is present while Q is absent. It can't tell us anything. So if we apply that rule to occurrence 0, we conclude that any of A, B, C, and D might be sufficient conditions for E that are present in an occurrence of E. So the idea is that once we've recorded an occurrence in which the conditioned property E is present, or it occurs, along with the presence or absence of some possible conditioning properties like we've got here, which we can think of as step 1 of the method of difference, then we apply step 2. In which we look for additional occurrences in which E is absent. So let's suppose we record the following two occurrences. Occurrence 1 in which A is present, B is absent, C is absent, D is absent, and E is absent too. And occurrence 2 in which A is absent, B is absent, C is absent, D is present, while E is absent. Now the method of difference can tell us something. Again, we're looking for which of the properties present in a certain occurrence of the conditioned property E are sufficient conditions for that conditioned property E. Occurrence 0, while it cannot tell us what the sufficient conditions are, tells us which of the possible conditioning properties are the ones we should be interested in. We say it defines the possible conditioning properties of interest. Now if we look at occurrence 0, we see that A, C, and D are the only possible conditioning properties that are present in this occurrence of E. So the method of difference first rules out B as a possible sufficient condition that we're interested in, because B is absent while C is present, and we're only interested in the ones that are present while E is present. So occurrence 0 defines the possible conditioning properties of interest as properties A, C, and D in this example. Then, to eliminate which of the possible conditioning properties are sufficient for E that are present in this occurrence of E, we apply the inverse method of agreement to the following two occurrences. So notice that in those two occurrences E is absent, so we can go ahead and apply the inverse method. Now remember the golden rule for the inverse method: a property that is present when a given conditioned property E is absent cannot be a sufficient condition for E. So if we look down at occurrence 1, we see that A is present while E is absent, so we can rule out A on the basis of occurrence 1. And if we look down at occurrence 2, we see that D is present while E is absent, so we can rule out D on the basis of occurrence 2. So what do we conclude? Occurrence 0 rules out B as even a possibility of a sufficient condition that we're interested in, because B is not present while E is present, and to apply the method of difference, we're only interested in suspected sufficient conditions that are present in this occurrence of E. Then occurrence 1 and 2 rule out A and D respectively as possible sufficient conditions for E that are present in this occurrence of E, and we can tell that using the inverse method of agreement. So we conclude if any of the properties present in this occurrence of E, occurrence 0, are sufficient conditions for E, by the method of difference, C is that sufficient condition. Now I just want to reiterate before we move on, it's important to notice what's different about this method compared to the inverse method. If we use the inverse method to test for sufficient conditions here, then on the basis of our observations, using the inverse method, B might also be a sufficient condition for E. But using the method of difference, we restrict ourselves to considering possible conditioning properties that are present in a certain occurrence of E, in occurrence 0. So using the method of difference, B is ruled out, because whether it's a sufficient condition for E or not, it's not a sufficient condition that we're interested in, because it's not present in occurrence 0. The method of difference is important for us, right? We can imagine a situation in which our murder detective, who we've been thinking in terms of, comes to a crime scene where there is a dead body. Suppose there are no marks on the body, it's just lying still on the floor. Then the detective's job is to figure out the cause of death. And from the detective's perspective, being run over by a steamroller, for example, is certainly a sufficient condition for somebody dying. But when they look at the body, they can see that while death, the conditioned property, is present, the property of being run over by a steamroller is absent, because the body just looks normal. So while being run over by a steamroller is a sufficient condition for death, it's not one that the detective would be interested in here, because that property is absent while the conditioned property is present. Okay, so just like before, we aren't restricted to simple possible conditioning properties here. One can also consider negations, disjunctions, and conjunctions as possible conditioning properties as well. So let's walk through one more example where we have some complex possible conditioning properties. Suppose our possible conditioning properties are the simple properties A, B, C, and D, along with the complex properties not A, not B, not C, and not D. And suppose we're interested in which of them are sufficient conditions for E that are present in a certain occurrence of E. So let's set up the table. Suppose we record occurrence 0 as follows. Suppose we have A present, B absent, C present, and D absent, while E is present. Remember, E is always going to be present in occurrence 0 when we're doing the method of difference. Then we can fill in the property table for the negations using what we know about property tables. So we'll have not A is absent, not B is present, not C is absent, and not D is present. So let's pause while we have a go at a quick question. So, applying the first step of the method of difference, the possible conditioning properties which are of interest to us here are A, C, not B, and not D, because they are the only ones present in the occurrence of E that we care about, in occurrence 0. So we've applied step 1 of the method of difference, we've defined the possible conditioning properties that we're interested in. Now suppose we record occurrence 1 like this. Suppose we have A present, B present, C present, and D absent, while E is absent this time. Then, using what we know from property tables, we fill in the rest of the table for the complex conditioning properties. We have not A is absent, not B is absent, not C is absent, and not D is present. Now finally, we want to apply step 2 of the method of difference, which is just to apply the inverse method to occurrence 1 to eliminate possible sufficient conditions. Now to do that, we apply the golden rule. A property that is present when a given conditioned property E is absent cannot be a sufficient condition for E. So here's another question. So when we do that, we find that just looking at occurrence 1, remember, A, B, C, and not D are ruled out as possible sufficient conditions because they're all present while E is absent. So what do we conclude from the method of difference? Remember, we're interested in which of the properties present in a certain occurrence of E, in occurrence 0 here, are sufficient conditions for E. Well, occurrence 0 rules out B, D, not A, and not C as conditions of interest because they are absent in the occurrence of E that we care about in occurrence 0. And then the inverse method applied to occurrence 1 rules out A, B, C, and not D as possible sufficient conditions. So we conclude that if any of the properties present in this occurrence of E, in occurrence 0, are sufficient conditions for E, then not B is that sufficient condition. So if we knew our list of possible conditioning properties did contain a sufficient condition for E, then applying the method of difference, we would conclude that that property is not B. Okay, some final words. So the method of difference is used to find suspected sufficient conditions present in an occurrence of a given conditioned property. Notice that what we've concluded in the examples we've looked at is something of the form: if any of the possible conditioning properties are sufficient conditions for E that are present in a certain occurrence of E, then such and such a property is that sufficient condition. The method doesn't tell us which of the possible conditioning properties are sufficient conditions that are present in an occurrence of E. It tells us which of them might be and which of them cannot be. And just like before, a conditioned property might have more than one sufficient condition, so there still might be more to it than what we can tell from the method. And what's more, if our initial list of possible conditioning properties doesn't include a sufficient condition that's present in a certain occurrence of a given conditioned property, then we won't be able to find it using the method. We would have to go back and use a more comprehensive list of possible conditioning properties to begin with. So your observations might eliminate everything in your initial list of possible conditioning properties. Okay, so next time we'll look at the last two methods, which are the combined methods. So have a go at your self-reflections, and I'll see you next time.